Hi guys, and welcome to Cultnomics. My name is Paul Hanley, and today I'm going to be chatting to you about a model of the effects of tariff on trade. In this video, we're going to look at the impact of a tariff on trade and on the welfare of the economy. In order to do that, we will first start with a downward sloping demand curve, and we will label this demand curve demand with D and DOM. The DOM in this case represents domestic demand. So this is demand from the perspective of the country we're looking at. In this case, we'll say the United States. We will also have in this model here a supply curve. So this will be the supply of the product by United States producers, by domestic producers in this case. So we will have our supply curve denoted S. And again, because it's from the perspective of the country we're looking at, we will have DOM for domestic. And again, we will say this is coming from the perspective of the US. Now, the equilibrium point between supply and demand will be in the center here. And what that would indicate is an equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand with no trade. So there's no trade in this model whatsoever. When we start to look at the actual curves themselves, we see that the demand curve is downward sloping, which tells us that as the price decreases in this economy, the quantity demanded by customers increases. So their willingness and ability to pay for a product increases. On the other side, we see with the supply curve, as the price increases in this economy, the willingness and ability of a producer to supply more products increases. So as prices increase, domestic supply also increases. To represent trade, what we are going to do is draw a horizontal line, and that horizontal line is drawn as follows, where we have supply. So it's the supply from countries outside the United States. So we call that supply from the world. So these are other producers outside of the US who are exporting into the US, making the US importers of products. And what we're going to say is that this tariff model here is looking at washing machines, because President Trump recently has increased the tariff or just a tax level on imported washing machines into the United States. So with this model here, we will start off at the lowest end point, and we will say that that represents zero washing machines bought and sold in the market. Now, in that situation, what we'll tend to have is two quantity points here. We will start off with the intersection of supply world and supply domestic, which is Q1. And we have the intersection of supply world with demand domestic, which is over here at Q2. And what we will say here is, and we'll refer over to the right hand side, we're looking at the pre-tariff trade within the US for washing machines. Domestic producers in this case here are producing from 0 up to quantity 1. So from 0 to quantity 1 is domestic production in our case here. So 0 to Q1. The welfare at this point for domestic producers is the area below the price line, which is represented by world supply. So we'll put that in as price level at world prices. So it is below the price line and above the supply curve. Now, in order to start putting these things in over on the right hand side, I'm going to put in some labels. So we'll start with point A over here, representing where the demand curve intersects with the y-axis. We will say point B is down here, where the supply curve is intersecting with the demand curve. We will say PW is this point in here, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we'll also say that we have a point here, which is C, and a point down below here, which is point D. So producer welfare is the area below the price line and above the supply curve, which is represented by PW, C, and D, if you can see that triangle here. So the welfare for the producer with a pre-tariff trade is PW, C, and D as indicated, so that triangle here. The domestic consumer then is consuming between 0 and Q2 washing machines. So quantity is between 0 and Q2, which we can see visually is different than what domestic producers are producing. So US producers are producing this much in terms of washing machines, however consumers want to purchase up to Q2. So in this case here, the welfare for the consumer is the area below the demand curve, demand domestic, and above the price line. And that area is represented by A, B, and PW. So we'll put it in here. A, B, and PW is the welfare here. Now, the difference between what US producers produce and what US consumers actually want to buy is between Q1 and Q2. So imports are between area Q1 and Q2. So that's what's being imported to the US from outside in relation to washing machines. And there's no welfare in terms of imports, so we'll just put in a little dash. The government hasn't got involved yet. There's no tax or tariff on the washing machines. So we'll put in 2 dashes here indicating no government involvement so far. Now, we're going to see the impact of a tariff in this model here. The impact of the tariff is going to be to increase the world price represented by PW. So if President Trump imposes, let's say, a 20% tariff on washing machines, what that does is it increases the price for every consumer in the United States. And therefore, when prices are shifted up, we can represent this with a new supply curve, a new world supply. And that is represented here by the red line, and that red line represents supply in the world plus our tariff. And because that increases the price, we now have a new price in our model, which is plus the tariff. So a higher price level indicated here. Now we look across this price and we see it's a horizontal line again representing perfectly elastic supply. So world suppliers can supply as much as US consumers want. And we're going to indicate a couple of points. We're going to see where it interacts with the supply domestic line, and we'll put in a line here and we'll call that quantity 3. And we will also see where it interacts with domestic demand, and we'll also bring this down to the quantity axis and we'll call that Q4. Okay, so now we have taxes imposed in this model here, and what has happened is a whole range of effects that we will trace through over on the right hand side. So the domestic producer in this case here is being protected by a tariff, and because of that, new producers have come online here in the United States, and they have the ability now and the willingness to produce more because they're being protected and they can charge a higher price. So in our case, the US producer can now produce between 0 and Q3. So they increase their production of washing machines. The welfare in this case here has also increased. It used to be the little small triangle between PW, C and D, but now what's after happening is they have gained welfare. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a couple of numbers here so we can talk about the welfare effect. So I'll put in 1 to represent this area here. We have 2 in the little triangle, 3 for this square in the center, and 4 over here in the other triangle. Now, the extra producer welfare that US producers now have is represented by area 1. So they have increased their welfare, and they've increased it by area 1 in this case, the area below the new price line and above the domestic supply curve. If we move on to US domestic consumers, what we now see is they are actually consuming less. They're consuming between 0 and quantity 4. So because the price of washing machines are now higher, US consumers are buying less of them. So down to Q4 in this case. Now, their welfare has been affected greatly. So every US consumer is paying more in terms of price, which represents a loss of welfare. And the loss of welfare is area 1, 2, 3, and 4. So area 1 plus area 2 plus area 3 and plus area 4 is lost in terms of US consumer welfare because they're paying higher prices. Now, what has happened to imports? Well, because there's a tax on imports and it's increased the price of them, what has happened is imports have reduced between Q3 and Q4. So Q3 up to Q4 is the new import level. So we can see that's reduced compared to Q1 and Q2. So less imports here, but we don't have any welfare effects. So we'll put in our little dash over here. And finally, we now have a government involved. And what is after happening here is the government is now taking a tax and taking revenue off all imports that are coming into the US economy. So between Q3 and Q4 is imports. The US government is taking taxes of 20% off of that. So their welfare has increased from absolutely nothing up to area 3, represented by the square over here. So area 3 is now the government welfare. Now, what you might have noticed is that there's two areas that we haven't yet spoken about, and these two areas are 2 and 4. So what we call these is something called D representing dead, W representing weight, and L representing loss. So deadweight losses. The deadweight losses are incurred because the prices are higher and there's less being consumed and produced in this market here. And the deadweight loss, the loss of welfare overall in the economy, is represented by area 2 and area 4. So these are entire losses to the economy. I hope you call back to Cultnomics soon. Bye for now.